Hi everyone, welcome to the second Torah study of the fall 2021 semester. Today, in anticipation of Thanksgiving, we're going to talk a little bit about the first Thanksgivings. And you notice that. So everyone is aware of the first Thanksgiving of 1789, when the president issued a proclamation. So there are two handouts. One that says First Thanksgivings on top, and the second handout, if you look at the third page, you can see the actual broadside from the rear book division of the New York Public Library, a proclamation, and we're going to go into detail a little bit of that. When I wrote the First Thanksgivings, I had actually another one in mind, and you can take a look here at the second handout. So this was a Thanksgiving of 1799. And it's really not a popular Thanksgiving that people talk about. It wasn't the first. It was actually limited to like New York City in the area, but it's very relevant to us in 2021, and I'll explain why. So let's go back 1 second. In 1789, the country had just really started. The president had been inaugurated, George Washington, and he asked the whole country to spend a day giving thanks and to make it a religious day. And interesting, so there was no rabbi yet in America, but there was a leader of the Jewish congregation of the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue, which, by the way, still exists today. And they've had a Thanksgiving ceremony service till today. You can go visit it. Now they moved uptown. I don't know. Any here from the West Side? No one here from the West Side? So it's called the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue, or it used to be called Shearith Israel. Still exists, and they've been, that's the oldest Jewish congregation, basically continuous in America. So what's interesting here is the lecture that Reverend Seixas is S-E-I-X-A-S, Gershom Seixas, the lecture that he gave was actually printed without his permission by the non-Jewish printer who felt it was such a beautiful service and a sermon. So that's why we have this print. We have it printed for us. And that's here. If you want to look at page 2 on First Thanksgivings, it tells you the order of service. There's two handouts. There's lunch. Please enjoy. Performed in the synagogue in this city on Thursday, the 26th of November, 1789, agreeable to the proclamation of the President of the United States. The following psalms were chanted. And we're going to look about that a little bit. I hope you all remember your Roman numerals. But if you don't, it's okay. I have it here in regular. So there is the first three verses of Psalm XC5. You all know that is 95. The whole of Psalm 30, 33, 34, 46, etc. And then a discourse. We'll talk about that maybe briefly by the Reverend Gershom Seixas, the Hazzan. Back then, there was no rabbi, so the leader of the congregation was the Hazzan. So Reverend, again, this was a Hazzan because it was a Spanish Portuguese. Most of them were descendants, 1 or 2 or 3 generations of Marranos, and he was the leader. And then other psalms and a prayer for the congregation, etc. And that's the famous Thanksgiving. What's the not famous Thanksgiving? So the one here on the right. At a meeting of the majority of the clergy, so it's very interesting, all the clergy of New York City got together in November 28, 1799, and they agreed to have a day of thanks for every congregation in New York City on the 19th of December, which he writes was the 21st of Kislev. And he presents the order of and here you have on the right, also the order of the service. 30, 33, 34, which is the same, but all of a sudden, he's switching to 90 and 91. Why was there a Thanksgiving in 1799? It's very interesting. And it's why it's so relevant. If you look at the next page, if you look at this page, page 1 here, look at the footnote. There was an epidemic of yellow fever in New York in 1798. And it killed 2,000 New Yorkers out of a total of about 60,000 New Yorkers, which is, unfortunately, a very high amount of New Yorkers who died in the yellow fever epidemic. Their handouts right if you want, at lunch. The yellow fever epidemic of 1798 into 1799. So this Thanksgiving, 1799, which was really limited to New York, was actually a Thanksgiving for epidemic ending. So I thought that would be very, very, hopefully our pandemic is ending, or we're about there. And here we have a precedent for having a Thanksgiving Day for the end of an epidemic. Now, truth be told, we know now that yellow fever, which is caused by mosquitoes, always ended usually at like November time.
I apologize so much. I was running around looking for the right room.
We actually started a few minutes late, and I was going to go stand on the lobby and see if anybody else is looking for the right room. We started early.
So all yellow fever we know now is carried by mosquitoes. Mosquitoes, in the cold weather, they go away. So usually it ended. There was a famous yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia in 1793. Which they they had a major quarantine. No one from Philadelphia could leave or come to New York, and again, that's also epidemic ended around November time. But nevertheless, so those are the two Thanksgivings I want to talk about today. So, and I did this a little bit about 2 years ago, but it doesn't hurt to repeat ourselves. So if you take a look at, we're going to skip. So if you could turn, I know it's like weird, on this handout to page 3, and on this handout to the. Also to page 3 or 4. To page 3 or 4. 4 would probably be better. So what I did was I made it legible and readable. The Thanksgiving Proclamation from October 3rd of 1789, when George Washington basically set the first Thanksgiving. Now, actually, I can't help myself because I teach history at the undergraduate level. So, but our Thanksgiving in America only started becoming a real tradition after the Civil War. The first Thanksgiving by George Washington and then by John Adams was stopped by Thomas Jefferson. And one of the reasons that we assume that happened was because Thomas Jefferson was a lot less religious than George Washington and John Adams. Were very, very deeply religious men. So, in a way, a public day of Thanksgiving, which is definitely a religious act, was frowned upon by Thomas Jefferson and Madison and those who followed. So that it fell out of favor until after the Civil War. Then it became more of a national day of thanks, and then just a national holiday. So if you take a look here, and this is what I'd like to imagine, and I think it's a good thing to imagine. Now, very interesting. George Washington was. You all know that the American capital, till it moved to Washington D.C., was New York City. So at George Washington's inauguration, Reverend Seixas was asked to speak. Now, the Jews of New York in 1789 were maybe 0.5% of the population. They were not a major. But Reverend Seixas was considered a Revolutionary War hero figure. He refused to. He was a patriot. He refused to become a loyalist. They all fled New York when the British took over. He was very strong in his patriotic fervor, and therefore he was honored in a way. So I always feel like I don't think George Washington ran this proclamation by Reverend Seixas, but if you think about the order of the service, the way the prayers went down in the synagogue on that Thanksgiving and the proclamation, there's a lot of overlap. And I want to show you that, if that's what I would like to just look at today, and then think about what was added in the Thanksgiving of 1799. So, where it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God. George Washington started out with saying is the background to Thanksgiving is recognizing that God runs the world. And the order of service on that day in the Shearith Israel, if you look at top page 3, is the first 3 verses of Psalm 95. Come, let us sing joyously to the Lord. Raise a shout for a rock and deliverer. Let us come into his presence with praise. Let us raise a shout for him in song. For the Lord is a great God, the great King of all divine beings. So I think there's a very, that overlaps perfectly. When you praise a God who's a deliverer, what you're saying is that he interacts with us in this world. And then he goes on to say, to be grateful for the benefits. Well, what benefits is he referring to? Right? That's the next Psalm, Psalm 30. A Psalm of David, a song for the dedication of the house. I extol you, God, O Lord, for you have lifted me up, and not let my enemies rejoice over me. And so it's unbelievable if you follow along with the proclamation of George Washington, and you follow along with the order of service in the shul, with which Tehillim they chose to say, it literally matches up almost perfectly. which again, I don't know if that's a coincidence. I don't think he spoke about it, but the concepts and the themes are really lock, stock, and barrel. They go together. And then not only that, right? We all know that not only do you be grateful, you have to continue to pray to God to implore His protection and favor. Well, that's literally what the next psalm was, Tehillim 33, which is the order of service. Sing for it, right? And you see here, again, many of you know this from the Hebrew. You say it maybe every Saturday at Shabbos. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world dread Him. For He spoke; it was commanded. He frustrates the plans of nations, brings the design of the peoples. So we hope and trust in our Lord. He is our shield. So it's sort of unbelievable. Now, just a historical question. Does anybody? I mean, no one knows really. Why did He pick the 26th of November? It's a very interesting question. Again, this proclamation went on October 3rd, 1789. Why did He say, okay, Thursday, November 26th? No one knows. No one knows. I want to make 2 points. One is, and this is relevant, again, for those of you interested, this is relevant. This is a big question today, as always. Is Thanksgiving a religious holiday? It's obviously, there's a lot of it giving thanks, but that we don't find services or church sessions or synagogue sessions for Thanksgiving. Back in the day, in the 1700s, especially the New England region, Thursdays was a very popular preaching day. So that's why He picked a Thursday. That wasn't because that was the day they had Kriyas Torah. It was the day that was considered preaching in the shuls. But actually, November 26th was the anniversary of the British leaving New York. In 1783, the last day that because again, New York was a British stronghold. Where we are on Long Island was one of the headquarters of the British. You would go down to the coast, anywhere from Atlantic Beach all the way here, you would see British ships. This was a British stronghold. And they finally left New York on 1783, November 25th. So it could be that it was like a yard site or a day, the end of the British reign, even though the war had ended in 1781. So that was could be. It's a conjecture on my part. And that's why I picked that day. So I'm just going to, as you can see, I underlined a lot of the points here that I just wanted to bring out. And it goes on, and if you'll notice, again, I'm back at the first Thanksgivings, Tehillim 34, Psalm 34, where you're talking about how God delivers from all your troubles, the angel of God camps around you, fear you God, how to be a good person. It really goes together. But then, and that's what I wanted to point out, and I wanted to point out that something a lot of people don't know, and that is, if you take a look at this handout, the next page has the actual letter written to the President of the United States of America. You can see it's very nicely, it's very hard to read, it's calligraphy. But you can notice the name on the bottom. The name on the bottom was Moses Seixas, Seixas, and it says there, I believe it says warden. He was the gabbai, we would say. He was the gabbai of not the shul in New York. He was the gabbai of the shul in Newport, Rhode Island. Now, one of the most important documents, especially to Jews in America, was this piece of paper. When George Washington went to visit Newport, he didn't go to the shul there. He was coming to the town, and the gabbai of the shul, Moses Seixas, cousin of this rabbi from New York, wrote him a letter of welcome. And in this letter, he wrote the famous words that are actually associated with George Washington because he replied to it, which is that this country that was being started will hopefully give to bigotry no sanction. Right? We'll give to, and one of the reasons, by the way, that we're called Turo. Does anybody know why we're called Turo? It's just one of those weird things. Turo was a man who eventually gave money to rename the synagogue in Newport. It is now called the Torah Synagogue. Back in 1790, it was not. It was called Mikveh Israel, the Hope of Israel. But eventually became known as the Torah Synagogue because Mr. Turo was one of the most important philanthropists in the middle 1800s. And Turo was always associated with this statement, with this letter. And the letter is that praying and asking George Washington to set up a country of to give bigotry no sanction. If you look back at the letter, which was really the Thanksgiving proclamation beforehand, George Washington already hinted to the civil and religious liberty which we are all blessed, acquiring and diffusing useful knowledge, and generally to grant unto all mankind a degree of prosperity as he alone learns. That one of the foundation in George Washington's eyes of this equality and this freedom came from a belief in the Almighty. And that is what Moses Seixas had appealed to him. And there's a lot of reason to give, in his Thanksgiving speech, which was a proclamation, which is a little before the letter to the congregation in Newport with the following year, really was, foundational from the Jewish community's perspective. So now I want to just quickly. This is all good and fine for that first Thanksgiving, but this is called First Thanksgivings. So if you take a look here at page 6 of this first handout, I'm sure you all know this very well. This is from Psalm 91, Yoshev B'Sefer Elyon. Many of you have read it over and over again. And you'll notice, if you go back to this page, the first page of this, that was one of the major additions and changes to the order of service of Thanksgiving was this chapter of Tehillim, Psalm 91. And if you read it just as a casual reader, some of you might know it well in Hebrew, but if you read it in English, you're like, right? Oh, you who dwell in the shelter of the Most High, I say to the Lord, you are my refuge and stronghold. He will save you from the trap, from the destructive plague. He will cover you with his people. You will find refuge under his wings. You need not fear the terror by night, or the arrow that flies by, the plague that stalks in the darkness, or the scourge that ravages at noon. 1,000 may fall at your left side, 10,000 at your right, shall not reach you. If you just read it in just the English, so it speaks to us. This is a perfect psalm for an end of a pandemic, and that's exactly what was going on here. And if you read it, it's an unbelievable speech. This speech is actually it's not popular. It's not printed anywhere except in his notes. It wasn't ever printed as like the other thing. That the 1789 speech, that was like a famous speech. It was printed. The non-Jewish public. It was printed in the newspaper. And there was no Jewish press or the Yated in 1789, but in 1799. We only have his notes. But if you look at this speech here, in this page 1 and 2 here, it's an unbelievable. He spoke about the benefits we received, and God. And I'm not going to go through it all because I know it's running late. And if you look at page 2, people fled the city. It's weird. New York City back then was literally just the bottom tip of Manhattan. Greenwich Village was considered out of the city. There was a debate. Is it a bad thing to run away from a plague? And he said people who ran away, it's okay, it's not a bad thing. That's over here. And now he says, God, impart thy divine wisdom to the rulers, administrators of government, etc., obviously. But listen to the words, and I think it's amazing how he wrote this in 1799 and how end of a pandemic, and we're in 2021, end of a pandemic, hopefully. Guard them from all evil and danger, secure in them their just rights and possessions. Remove far from them the spirit of envy and jealousy. Let no discord prevail in their councils or in their armies. Unite them in the bonds of brotherly and social love. And let peace and harmony reside perpetually among them. I think that's an unbelievable lesson because, when in times of pandemic and in times of fear and in times of, back then, you had no idea what caused pandemics. There's a lot to fear and it just causes discord. So now he goes, okay, it's over. We're all going to move back to the city and we're all going to get along together and everything should work out. I want to end with this, and this is just one of those quirks of history. This happened on the 19th of December. So again, the clergy of New York City got together, proclaimed this, then on the 19th of December they're going to do this. And that's what he spoke about on the 19th of December. All good and fine. On the 20th of December, word got to New York that George Washington had died. Now, he had died actually December 14th in 1799, but there was no internet or Twitter, so word only got. So now if you take a look here on the right, I actually have the city council minutes, page 2 and page 3. This is the actual city council minutes of the City Council of New York. So here you say, the clergy of New York, having agreed to set apart Thursday next as a day of Thanksgiving, the council recommends that everyone should put up signs. Okay, and that was from the council meeting on the 16th of December. And then you'll notice on the bottom left on page 3, which was the next council meeting on the 20th of December, the mournful information of the death of His Excellency George Washington, and everyone should ring bells and lower flags and be mourning the president. I think it's very it's coincidental that this speech at the end of the pandemic coincided literally with the announcement of the death, or the week of the death of George Washington. The first Thanksgiving really was something that George Washington tried to make a religious and tried to promote something, and felt it was beautifully carried out in the Jewish synagogue with the reading of the Psalms, which perfectly mirrored what he wanted. And then the next Thanksgiving, which was very private, which was very, very specific to the pandemic, also coincided with, unfortunately, his death, and which ended the era when in America or New York, they as a country, as a nation, they would look very religiously at events. And I think that really ended that era, because when the next time Thanksgiving came around, really in the 1800s, in the Civil War, it was a less and less of a religious holiday. So the first Thanksgivings were very religious, had a very, very strong relevance to the Jews of New York City, to the first major Jewish figure, Shearith of New York. And as we approach Thanksgiving, I think it's something that we could think about. So I thank you all for joining me.